Now, environmental, civic and advocacy groups have criticized the South African government's acceptance of funds to finance the transition to cleaner energy. They say that the funding structure comprises poorer states which have played no role in contributing to the climate crisis. Joining us now is Awande Buthelezi, who is a researcher at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center. Thank you for making time for us this afternoon, Awande. Why do you believe South Africa has undermined historical climate justice demands and shouldn't have really taken part in these commitments that have been made by most of these richer countries?
Well, thank you for having me. And there's two ways to look about it. The first is the fact that they've sold out the African continent and the rest of the developing world by buying into the geopolitical power games of the North American, United States, Canada, and the European states for a quick opportunity to gain access to funding at the expense of other vulnerable states. If you look at what had happened in the previous COP prior to this, last year's COP, you could see that these global north countries had positioned it as a COP for coal, slamming countries like China, India, and ourselves, who are heavily reliant on coal, whereas their reliance on oil and gas was conveniently put aside. Taking into account the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, their insistence or their dependency on oil and gas has only intensified. And South Africa has played into these games and compromising other poorer countries that have played no role in contributing to the climate crisis. And also the loan-heavy financing of these loans, or the loan-heavy financing structure of these loans and grants, has undermined historical calls for climate debt, loss and damage and to be written off for African countries and other global south countries that have not been responsible for the climate crisis.
Yeah, and you speak about the loan-heavy finance structure. There are a lot of organizations that have come up to say there's something wrong with the financial commitments that have been made so far, because if you look at the commitments which are in a form of funds, which are also in a form of loans, I think only 4% of these commitments are in grants and the rest are just loans and guarantees. But government will argue, well, if you were going to take a similar loan from, let's say, the World Bank or the IMF, the interest rate will be high and the conditions will be different. So this is a bargain, they would say.
I mean, you're right. They probably would say that this is a bargain, but we also have to contend with the fact that our government is looking for wins. And in the context of the climate crisis, in the context of this kind of funding required for our transition away from our coal heavy dependency, and same for other countries, particularly developing countries, this sets a very dangerous precedent. There have been historical calls for climate debts to be paid by these countries, and also for loss and damage and debt to be written off. And these are serious calls. There's a serious thinking behind these calls also. So by our government accepting this and saying that this is a win, it sets a very dangerous precedent that undermines the collective struggle for global climate justice, and in a sense it helps legitimize the global north's geopolitical game, but also helps divert the attention away from their historical role in global emissions and the reluctance to wean off their dependency, despite the fact that they also need to pay this debt in some form or another.
Yeah, and I think there's no question that the global north countries could do more, right, especially given their historic culpability for climate change. But, I mean, what did you expect government to do? To say no to the loans? You know, what other options were there? Are you suggesting that they could have been more, strict here and put their foot down in negotiating the conditions of the loan and the amount of money that must be due from these richer countries? Because I can tell you at the end of the day, the just transition is a program that government has got to undertake, and just being the operative word. And we don't have money to carry through that program. We're going to need the help of these richer countries.
No, 100%. We will need them to finance this transition. But our critique, rather, of the government is that it begins with their plan and their framing of a just transition.
Yeah.
We earlier on in the year had released a critique of the Presidential Climate Commission's framework for a just transition, on top of which this Just Energy Transition Partnership and the Just Energy investment plan is built off of. And when you look back at that framework and its framing for a just transition, or how they saw a just transition, there was a lot about it that was not just. It was poor in its ability to properly analyze and take into account the country's deep structure of inequality and poverty, and it barely barely put a lens to how huge emitters within our country like Eskom and Sasol would decarbonize. And then also there's a lot to be asked for with regards to the just aspect of how workers and communities will be transitioned, and how funding, future funding such as this funding, would be able to play that role in putting workers and communities in the driver's seat to have the agency and autonomy required for that transition to be just. So built on that flimsy foundation, this is added on. And I think that 100% we're going to require their funding. But where our government has agency and a role to play in terms of how it structures and sees this transition, we have to absolutely be critical as South Africans, as Africans, as people of the global South, because this is the role and this is the part that we have agency over, and our government has failed us in this regard.
Yeah, and we can't be pressured by these richer countries when we know what the consequences will be down the line. You're saying there's a lot of unjust in how these processes are carried out. I was remembering just now how they've actually been failing to honor their previous pledges. I mean, they failed to do so after the COP26 in Glasgow and COP21 in Paris. And that has created this lack of trust between developing and developed countries. But do you think there's enough social security support for affected communities and workers, such as those in the country's coal belt in Mpumalanga? Because even the International Labour Organization has called for social security and employment guarantees to those affected workers, to the youth, to the communities as a whole who are affected by this energy transition.
Clement, I think that's a great question. And I think for the viewers and anyone who's concerned about this issue and anyone who wants to understand in more depth what a just transition actually entails, it means nothing without workers and communities. And I think that for me, that is the part which our government has explicitly failed us in with regards to how they've communicated their plans for the just transition and how they've communicated these sorts of deals that they're making. We don't see communities at the forefront. We don't see communities having a voice, and we don't see workers represented or having a voice with regards to how they understand this plan will be put into effect and the role in which they will play. And without that, then it's not a just transition at all. It's just a transition, or an unjust transition at best, which is very scary considering the place where our country is economically, inequality-wise, and where we're headed. They at the end of the day, they're leaving it with us.
You've got to really have civil society, organized labor, and all the other stakeholders involved from the onset. Awande Buthelezi, thank you for making time. Researcher at the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center.